Hi there, welcome. We're here today to look at what it takes to write an excellent introduction for a research article to submit to a journal. So let's get started. The introduction of every journal article has three main functions. The first one is to establish a framework, whether it's a theoretical framework, a policy framework, but it establishes a framework for the research so the reader understands why you're doing this research. It also states the purpose of the work, including the research questions, hypotheses, questions, or problems that you're investigating. So in other words, it helps formulate the problem that you'll be addressing in your study. Finally, a really strong introduction also establishes the rationale and the approach that you're going to be using in your study. So it provides a rationale for the data sources and evidence that you'll be using in your study. Every good introduction contains 6 key elements. The first is a statement of the broad theme or topic of the study. The second is the theoretical and practical importance of the topic being explained. In other words, you don't want to leave the reader to figure out for themselves why your study is important. You need to spell it out so that they can see, oh yes, I see why this problem is important and how it fits in either theoretically or practically or policy-wise. You also provide a summary of the available literature, and you cite the most important prior studies that are relevant to your study. In other words, not only are you explaining why it's important, but you show what the field knows and how you're going to be taking it further. And by identifying the gaps in the literature or inconsistencies or controversies in the field, that's another way that you'll be demonstrating the value of your research, how it fits in theoretically and practically within the field, and it will also help the reader understand what the contribution your study will be doing to the field. You'll also provide a clear indication of the core research problem or questions that you'll be addressing, the specific research objectives, the context where you'll be doing the research, the units of analysis of the study, and an outline for the structure of the rest of the article. So the introduction is really important because it helps set the stage for the rest of your work. You're setting up why your research is important theoretically, practically, how it fits in the field and how it's going to contribute, and how you're going to be addressing it. So your research article is scientific storytelling, and in the introduction, you're going to be setting the stage and setting up your story arc. What you'll see is that in the introduction, there are 4 components that tend to follow a general structure. You'll have the introduction to your introduction or literature review. You'll have the background literature review, the research questions paragraph, and the closing paragraphs. So what you'll be doing is you'll provide the big motivation of your study, get a little narrower by providing the theoretical and or policy frameworks in your background literature review. You identify the problem that your study will be addressing in the research questions paragraph. And in the closing paragraph, you may need to elaborate on the significance of your study and describe how your study will answer the research questions that you've developed. In other words, you're being very explicit, not just in providing the rationale for your study, but also showing the reader why your study is important and how it will contribute. So the introductory part of your literature review has a fairly standard sort of structure. You'll start with the broad motivation with a paragraph that starts with a broad scientific or social problem that you'll be addressing. And then what you'll do is you'll work like a funnel and get more and more specific and more narrow until you reach the unique problem that your study will address. So what you're doing is you're contextualizing your research in the big problem. So it may deal with income inequality and the big picture and how your study will be addressing it in a much more narrower way. You'll also provide in the second paragraph focusing on the science to solve those problems. So you might use a format like, to solve this particular problem, researchers are, and then you'll describe the broader research field. So what you do again in providing the specific research topic, if you've identified literacy as being a key to solving educational outcomes and long-term problems, then you'll move down into how literacy researchers are studying the problem that you're interested in. So what you do is you set the big picture so that way you're able to help the reader understand how your specific research addresses the big picture in the field and moves the field as a whole forward. All right, now you've already set up the reader to understand how your research is going to fit within the field as a whole and solve social and educational issues as a whole. Now what you're going to do is delve deeper into the literature about the topic. And rather than saying a study did this, a study did that, you're going to organize it around 2, 3, maybe 4 themes that all come together to tell a story. So that organization will help you synthesize the literature about what's known about the theory or the policy or the practice and make it clear to the reader. So for each theme, you're going to summarize what's known and cite sources. You're going to identify the shortcomings in the knowledge base, including both limitations in individual studies, such as assumptions or methods, or limitations in that knowledge base as a field. So is there an issue that's common in the field, such as methods or assumptions or caveats that's been neglected? Has the field only focused on one particular population and hasn't examined how it might affect other learners, other individuals? So if there are collective shortcomings in the field, that will help you present the gaps in the research and motivate your study. And what you'll do is you'll identify how this limitation or gap is important for motivating your study. All right, you've been discussing the literature, telling the reader what the field knows about the issue you're interested in, critiquing the literature as you've been going, identifying some of the gaps in the literature. Now, rather than having the reader figure out for themselves why your research is important, you're going to explicitly state in a cohesive paragraph what that gap is in the literature that you're going to be addressing. So you're telling the reader what the field doesn't yet know, what the limitation is that needs to be addressed, and that's the burning reason behind the questions that you have. Then you'll say, okay, given this research gap, here's the question that your study will answer. Now, it might include a central question with supplemental questions, but it's really important to identify what the overarching question is and how the supplemental questions fit in and fill in the details. For some research, so some quantitative psychological research requires you to explicitly state your hypotheses. So you'll do that here as well. Now that you've identified the gaps and the flaws in the literature and the research questions that you're asking to fill that gap, now you're going to tell the reader what you're going to do to address this issue. How are you going to answer your research questions? So the goal here is to help the reader see how your study will answer your research questions and address the gap you've identified. You may need to cite some additional sources that don't contribute to the research gap, but may reflect the research methods you'll adopt. And you may start that paragraph with simply stating, to answer this research question, we apply, and you'll describe the methods. So in this paragraph, what you're doing is you're making an explicit connection between the methods you'll be using, the data sources you'll be using, the evidence that you'll be using to answer your research questions to address the gap in the literature. And you'll close by saying how your research questions will fill the research gap. And sample language you could use is by addressing research question. This project fills the research gap. Filling that research gap advances the niche research topic area by describing how the study advances the topic. These advancements improve our understanding of and you connect to the broader scientific field. So what you're doing for the reader is helping them see how the methods of your study will address this research gap that you've identified, which will help inform the field more specifically and narrowly in your narrow field, but also improve the field as a whole. This helps the reader understand the significance of your research and makes them want to keep on reading more.